My Mother, the Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. At this point on the journey of my mother living with Alzheimer's 11 years after the diagnosis, what I'm struggling with, especially for the last few weeks, is that where is the line? Where do I draw the line of what to report to my mother's medical team and what not to report? As I had explained in the previous episodes, my mother had been admitted to hospice. She is still at home with me, but now I, as her caregiver, and my mother as the care receiver, the person living with Alzheimer's, we have access to hospice support. And that means we have access to a doctor that would come regularly to assess my mother at home, and I could reach out to if I needed, if I had questions, if my mother developed symptoms. Also, we have access to hospice triage nurse, a nurse that could hear my concern and pass it to the doctor. Also, I have access to a nurse that comes to the house every 2 weeks once, but I could call the nurse and ask her to come if I am concerned about something that's going on with my mother. And based on what I think is the best situation for my mother right now, which is to be at home and surrounded by her family and as comfortable as possible. But then within that wish, which I think my mother would have wanted if she could speak for herself, is that where is that line? I appreciate that this is not something a lot of caregivers want to talk about or comfortable talking about. And it took me a lot of time to come around to that issue and speak to it in this podcast and admit it to myself and ask questions surrounding that. For example, 2 weeks ago, my mother's blood pressure started to spike. Keep in mind that my mother had no history of high blood pressure. But just like her diabetic onset late last year, this just came. One morning she woke up lethargic, and it was all I could do to get her to eat her breakfast. I checked her sugar level was normal, so I checked her blood pressure, and her blood pressure was 165 over 85, which is really, really too high for my mother. She always had 120 over 65. She never had anything above that. I reported it. I called the nurse, and the nurse came. She found the same thing. And the nurse called the doctor, and the doctor said, keep an eye on that. So I created this spreadsheet on my computer, taking her blood pressure and tracing it. When is the blood pressure too high? When is it close to her normal level? So I found out that early evening, when it's right after dinner, before she went to sleep, the blood pressure is really high all throughout the night and the morning. And by the time 9-10 o'clock came around, it gradually goes down to her normal level. 118, 120 over 65, 120 over 70, 120 over 68. And I am documenting all this. But in the back of my mind, if I do not resuscitate on my mother, and I do not want to take her to the hospital if I can help it, then why am I recording this blood pressure? Where is my line? what am I going to do with the information? So that question, an answer to that question means I either continue to record this document and decide at some point, on some level of this blood pressure, I would take her to the hospital. Or I would continue to record it and say, okay, I just want to know for my information. And if I wanted to know for my information, what am I going to do with that information? So you could see the conundrum. If I have the information and I could see my mother's blood pressure continues to rise or fluctuate back and forth, then am I going to take her to the hospital? If I am not going to take her to the hospital, if I am going to sit on this information, if I am going to not use it to get her to the hospital or get her help, why am I collecting this information? So you could see how difficult the situation could get. And these are one of the times when I wish there was somebody else making this decision, so I don't have to take responsibility for the decision. Also, the support for hospice, I get a social worker that I could speak to every other week, which I've been doing. And that is intended to help me deal with caregiver challenges. And that is service I just was able to access after my mother was admitted into hospice. And I wish that was services I could have accessed before. I shared this feeling with the social worker and I said, this is what I'm struggling with. And I don't really know when to report my mother's challenges to the doctor and when not to. And I'm struggling to figure out when to worry about, be concerned about something that's going on with my mother and when not. When is it helpful for me to have information and when is it not helpful to have this information because I might have information that there's nothing I can do with this information. So my mother's blood pressure is going up and down, and it goes up at this time of the day and goes down at this time of the day. If I have that information, does that mean I would take her to the hospital? Which I don't want to do. So you could see the conundrum here. So I spoke to the social worker about this, and the social worker said, I am going to email the doctor and give her this question, and maybe you can follow up and ask this question. So the question is written and it's phrased the way we both thought would be appropriate. So when the hospice doctor came to visit my mother, I brought the question and I said, where do I draw the line? How do I know when it's helpful for me to contact you, to contact the nurse, and when it's not helpful for me to contact the nurse? So this is how the hospice doctor put it. She said that it's a good idea every time you're concerned to contact the hospice triage nurse, and that nurse will take the information, and that information is always helpful because it will help us to make sure that your mother is not in pain. It will help us to make sure that whatever it is that's going on, it's not something that's causing her discomfort. So collecting the information is still helpful. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it to get her to the hospital. So call anytime you are concerned, call the hospice triage nurse. She would reach me or other doctors with the hospice, and we will make a medically sound decision that's also helpful to your mother, that's also respecting her wishes of being among her family and at home as much as possible. So the doctor said to me, this is not zero-sum game. It's not like if you collect the information, you have to go to the doctor. If you don't want to go to the doctor, you don't have to collect the information. So collect the information, report it, and together, you as the caregiver and us as the medical team, we will make a decision, and our decision will be guided by you and the wish that your mother remains at home and remains comfortable and void of pain. And that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. The elder found a wife for your father. It was Marian that brought the news to Timiro. The idea of her father needing a wife had existed since her mother's departure. Timiro had married Nitsa Kane so her father would have a dowry for a new bride. But now she was back home, and her father had to return the dowry, so she discarded the idea of him wanting a wife altogether. My father has no money. Her father's lack of dowry delighted Timiro now, but she wouldn't tell this to a single soul. She hated herself for thinking it with glee, like the nausea that pushed her stomach content during the first few weeks of her pregnancy. The words left her lips without her permission. She wanted her father to remain married to her mother. How would he pay for the dowry? The woman is the elder's cousin, Wedis chimed in as she dropped the load of firewood next to her cooking shed. She is a widow and the elder is her only living relative. This was unheard of. And they want no dowry? Timira asked as her mind moved to form a plan to discourage her father from listening to the elder. Like a tight ball of yarn, her thoughts unspooled fast, rolling out one idea after another. They would give her to a man who has no dowry, as if she were nothing? Timira phrased it that way because she wanted these women to take that back into the gossip mill. She was sure that would upset any woman and her family. The elder wants to help your father, Marian said. My father needs no help. Timira's words came much louder than she would have liked. He has his family. Timira scanned women's faces for traces of fake laughter. She saw none and continued. My brother and I are his family. He never said he needs a wife. Marian and Wedis turned to her with gentle eyes that showed no judgment, even though Timiro saw it as part of their facade. Your father is a good man who suffered a terrible blow. Marian sounded sincere, but Timiro didn't believe her. A week after Marian introduced the topic, Timiro's father told her, I am taking a new wife. Sitting across from her and Farah, he maintained firm eye contact upon them. A new wife? Timira acted surprised. From where? Her father told her the same story the woman had, about how the elder had told him about a good widowed woman. I get a wife and you and your brother get a mother. Stepmother, Timiro corrected him. We had a mother already. Her anger was pushing itself out despite Timira's desire to contain it. Her mother had left them over 3 years ago, and it was well past time for her father to marry again. Still, something dreadfully selfish bubbled in the pit of her stomach. The feeling that it wasn't her father getting married, but another woman replacing her mother swept over her. She wanted to say something but didn't because she feared her words. You don't have to get married to give us a mother, Farah protested. We are a family the way we are. You are right, I don't have to, her father said, but I want to. That was it. Her father spoke the truth. Timira was old enough to know her father was a man with a need. Her father deserved a wife, she reminded herself. After what happened to him in the last 3 years, the death of his son, his wife deserting him, and losing his grandson, he deserved the world. So she bit the inside of her cheek to chase the evil thoughts out of her mind. 6 months after the word of a new wife was mentioned, Timira's father prepared to travel to the woman's village 3 hours away by a bus. It would only be a day or 2. This was the first time her father had left Timiro and Farah since they returned from the city. Where is Anne-Marie will help if you need them. We don't need anyone. Timiro latched onto that safe statement to stop the rest of the thoughts in her head from betraying her. I can care for Farah, myself, and the house. That wasn't entirely true. Timira needed help with the milking cow, but she didn't want to admit that. Not more than 3 days, her father said as he walked away from Timiro and her brother with the elder and 2 other men to meet with the woman. It was the midday of the 4th day since their departure that her father, the elder, and the 2 other men returned. A woman, tall and slender, walked behind them. She walked carefully, her gaze trained on the ground between her feet. She seemed to pay close attention to every step she took, as if measuring the distance between her strides. This was the longest time Timira had been apart from her father for years. She wanted to run to him and give him the biggest hug her arms would allow, but she didn't, because she didn't know if her father even wanted her to hug him like a child would. Things were different now. Her father had another woman that wasn't her mother. She didn't want this new wife to see her as a child, someone that shouldn't be taken seriously. So Timira stood her ground in the safety of the main door to her home and waited. This is your Edo, Timira's father introduced her stepmother. She was younger than her mother was when she died. What's your name, Edo? Timira asked the woman, standing between the elder and her father. The woman seemed to be doing her very best to hide in plain sight. Perhaps she wanted to appear as though she didn't see the disapproving glances from Timira and her brother. Fadumo. The woman spoke quietly. Timira almost didn't hear her. Could you take your stepmother inside to change and rest? Timira's father took the elder and the 2 other men toward the field, perhaps to inspect the farm. Come with me. Timira led her stepmother toward the house. Timira knew this woman had left her family and home to be with them. She knew how hard that was, the isolation that comes with that. It was her job to welcome this woman into their home, connect her with the people in her village, her people, as her father had called them. Timira didn't feel generous, not to a woman to replace her mother. This way, you can go in there. Timiro pointed to a room. That's where my parents sleep. 3 years have passed since her mother had last been in that room. She didn't even die in it, but none of that mattered. Timira wanted to make sure the woman knew she didn't belong. She could go inside, set the belongings she'd brought with her in the wood chest her mother kept her clothes. She could even share the bed with her father and pretend she was the woman of the house. But the space itself, the dirt floor, the logs that made up the walls, the wooden shutters that marked her home different from all the other houses in the village, and the bed itself would never be hers. Timira waited, but the woman said nothing and did nothing. The silence held a long beat between them. "Come with me." Timira spoke to the woman as though she was a child. But the woman made no protest. She just followed her. "That's where my mother keeps her clothes, incense, and hair stuff." Timira used the present tense as if her mother had just stepped away for a moment and would be back to resume her presence in the house. Timira tapped a wooden chest on the right side of the door. "My father had built it for my mother even before I was born." Many times, Timira traced her fingers over the outline of the 3 colorful butterflies with their wings wide open, drawn on the smooth surface across the top. This time she didn't touch it. Instead, she walked away from Fatima and stood under the window on the other side of the room, giving herself a vantage point to watch. She expected her stepmother to take her mother's things out and put hers in their place. But that's not what happened. Fatima picked up a 4-legged stool from the back of the room and placed it in front of the chest. She sat on it and pulled Timira's mother's clothes with the gentlest motions, as if the dresses were made from fragile things that would shatter with the slightest of movements. One by one, she moved the items to one side. "These are here for you whenever you want to have them." Fatima spoke to Timira without looking up. Her tone was kind, even consoling. Every girl needs her mother's things. She folded all her clothes and tucked them into the small crevice she'd created. Timira's knowledge of stepmothers came from the woman in the fairy tales her mother had told them. In these stories, one woman tied her stepdaughter to stake over the cooking fire to cook and clean until the girl died standing. Yet another woman led her 2 stepdaughters to the forest, where they died from hunger. Victims were always girls, and fathers oblivious to their daughters' sufferings. When Timira took Fatima inside, she expected her stepmother to exhibit the telltale signs of the misery inflicted by the woman in her mother's stories. She didn't. Instead, she was painfully kind. Fatima removed her headscarf and let her long, dark and thick curly hair fall out of the red ribbon that held them together, cascading down her upper back. She took a wooden pick out of her bag and brushed her hair in long strokes. "Could you show me around the house and the village after I get changed?" Her behavior didn't fit Timira's expectations, and she didn't know how to react. "Yes," she said. As they walked around the house, on their way to the market and back, Timira waited for things to go wrong, for Fatima to display the actual colors that marked the woman of her kind. Nothing happened. In the lull of the heavy sleep that took her that first night, Timira promised to try and accept the woman for her father's sake. But her resolve cracked by the time day broke, and the new woman's laughter filled the house. The anger ignited by the woman's invasion took hold. Did she want to show up and pretend this homestead and its people belonged to her, lying in her mother's bed and giggling with her father? Timira lost so much. To lose her father to this woman was not something she was willing to allow. Mariam and Wedis brought food to the family as a welcome gift to the bride. They cleaned the house for the week that followed Timira's stepmother's arrival. "Don't you worry about anything," Mariam said when Fatima told them she didn't mind cooking for her family. You are a new bride, and we're here for you," Wedis said. "This is the least we can do." Their smiles wide and bright, they came and went under the pretense of doing their duty. But Timira knew their real motives. The goal was to size the woman up, to pick gossip points, and Timira was their contact within the home. How foolish to come into another woman's home and try to replace her, Timira finally told her friends. She wants to be a mother to someone else's children. The words she wanted to keep hidden spilled out. "Did you see how she hugged me like my mother?" Saadia and Ambiya agreed with her, unlike her father. "I wouldn't make it easy for her to take my mother's place if I were you," Saadia said to Timira on the afternoon of the second day. "This woman is trying too hard." From the morning of the third day, Timira stayed in bed longer, leaving her stepmother to do all the chores: cooking, cleaning, collecting the eggs, picking vegetables from the garden, and fetching the water. Fatima didn't try to wake Timira up or complain to her father. "Could you please grind the millet?" Fatima asked Timira on the fourth day, since she came to them. "We need flour for the bread." "Yes," Timira said. But she had no desire to do what she'd been asked. She left the millet in the sack next to the grinding stone, even though she'd agreed to grind it for breakfast the following day. The rage Timira had expected to spew out of her stepmother when she found the coarse seeds in the sack didn't materialize. Fatima placed the bag in the seed bowl and went to Mariam's house to borrow flour for the bread she needed to mix for breakfast. The snickers and the snide comments that followed her trip to another woman's cooking shed didn't seem to upset her. She didn't even tell Timira's part when her father asked Fatima why their millet wasn't ground. "I just forgot to get to it, is all," Fatima said. "Timira could do that. She had done it ever since her mother's passing," her father said. "I'll keep that in mind," Fatima responded, and Timira's father dropped the matter. Timira was at a loss of how to get this woman to leave her family. Timira ran off with her friends before she'd finished her chores each day, but that didn't make her stepmother react as she'd expected. Timira saw that Fatima did everything without complaint. With all of Timira's awful behavior, she saw no resentment in Fatima. The nastier she got, the gentler Fatima behaved. "She might surprise you if you let her," her father told her one night after he found out she didn't help out for the entire day. "Everyone else could see she needs to go but you," Timira told her father. "You're listening to women like Mariam and Wedis?" Did her father know what was happening to his daughter? Was he like one of those fathers in her mother's stories? They're against her because she is from a different tribe, not because they're watching out for you. Her father's words made Timira angry. "She's better than all of them," he said. Her father was right. Fatima greeted Timira and Farah each morning with the same bright eyes she'd watched their father as he ate his breakfast. Unlike Timira's mother, breakfast was ready by the time the call for the morning prayer came from the local masjid. "Be as kind to her, Timira, as she is to you," her father reminded her each morning as he left for the field. Still, Fatima didn't demand that Timiro and her brother treat her as if she were their mother. She seemed to have come with no expectations, no preconceived notions of how she should be treated. "Do you want me to braid your hair?" Fatima asked Timiro at the beginning of the 4th week with them. No. Timiro didn't want to explain herself, not to Fatima anyway. This must be the first layer of her trick, Timiro thought to herself, a way to get her to lay her guard down so she could betray her the minute she trusted her. In Timiro's mind, her stepmother was there to replace her mother, and she wouldn't allow that. Even in his nightly encouragement to give the woman a chance, her father couldn't dissuade her. What did he know? He wasn't the one stuck in a house with another woman pretending to be her mother. "Only my mother braids my hair." Timiro tried to be extra cruel. If her actions of not helping around the house didn't bring Fatima's real character, her rejection would do the trick. It didn't. Fatima greeted Timiro's comment with a kind gaze that showed more understanding than anger. Was the woman made from stone, strong and unfeeling? "You must miss your mother," she said so gently. Timiro almost cried. The level of her generosity was so incomprehensible that it was impossible to see it as genuine. "I know how that feels because I lost my mother as a girl too." Fatima rested her hand on Timiro's shoulder, and Timiro didn't try to push her away, even though she wanted nothing more than to bite into the flesh of her arm. "When you are ready, I am here to help," Fatima said, taking Farah to the outhouse to help him shower. The next time she needed her hair done, Timiro asked her stepmother if she could fix it before she went to the market with her father. "What do you think?" Timiro's jaw dropped down to her chest. The reflection in the mirror was a girl, young and innocent, untouched by all the trouble she'd gone through. "You don't like it?" Fatima sounded concerned. "I can undo and redo it if you want me to." "I love it." Indeed, Timiro did love it. With that face, she could imagine returning to the land of childhood with none of the worries of adulthood that governed her life since her mother's leaving. My Mother, the Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.